Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, Fabulites. I have some thoughts for you about the 1833 Detroit Rebellion. And apparently it's Juneteenth. I don't know why. I didn't realize this morning when I woke up that, a lot of people are celebrating Juneteenth today. But this is also the 184th anniversary of the Blackburn Uprising in Detroit. So just got finished, just left to talk at the museum, and I'll have to try to find, I'll find the name probably and put it in the title of the video. But the presenter was Jamon Jordan, and he is the president of our ASLA chapter, American Historical Society. I'm not sure what ASLA stands for, so I'll try to find a link for that too. Okay, so he said one of the things that I thought was important was that a large part of the history of Detroit is a history of race and racism, similar to the history of this country. And if you skip that part, the treatment of black folks, the involvement of black folks, then you're skipping black agency, black activism, and black self-determination. And we have over 300 years of black community development in Detroit. The old city jail, which became Wayne County Jail, which is now the Skillman Branch Library downstairs, does not have a historical marker there, but it is the site of a historical happening. So we're going to talk about that in a minute, or, he kind of got into that. It's a lie when you say that Michigan was an anti-slavery state. I think we talked about this before, because of that grandfathering in of enslavement, and there's just a whole history of that, like the French had the colony or Detroit or whatever, and then the British had the colony, and then America had the colony. And when the British took over from the French were allowed to keep doing what they had been doing. When America took over from the British and the French were allowed to keep doing what they had been doing. There's something called the Jay Treaty. There's like a whole history. But basically, people were, at the same time that people were escaping to Detroit for their freedom, people were escaping from Detroit for their freedom. The first known black person that we have in the United States, or documented or whatever, is an unknown Negress who in 1736 was buried on the grounds of the original St. Anne's Church, which was part of Fort Detroit. So that's our first known African. Another thing I didn't know is that Detroit, I had heard that Detroit had ribbon farms, but I didn't understand that these ribbon farms became the streets. So they were like long, thin farms, and that became what is many of our streets. So Cass, Rivard, Randolph, Bobian, and many of these ribbon farms were farmers, were slaveholders. Not all of them, but many of them were. So he talked a little bit about Augustus Woodward. He talked about Elijah Brush. We know those names, Woodward Avenue and Brush. He talked about John R., who was a real historical figure. He talked about Elizabeth Dennison Forth, who started in slavery and ended up being a wealthy property owner. And so that we kind of learned her name. We say your name, Elizabeth Dennison Forth. Thank you, Ashe, for the work that you've done on behalf of us. Campo was another big slave-holding family in Detroit. Lewis Cass was another villain in Detroit. He enslaved African people, but he tried to hide it. He tried to present himself as neutral. I'm not for slavery or against slavery, but meanwhile, in his diary, he's recording the sale of people. And so that's how his biographer, ended up outing him on that fact. So this Blackburn uprising has to do with someone named Thornton and Rutha Blackburn. They were a couple. Thornton found out, or Rutha and Thornton found out, that Rutha was being sold from Kentucky down the river to New Orleans as a fancy woman. that's sexual slavery. So specifically, I mean, I guess any woman was potentially a sexual slave, but these fancy women were specifically, used in that way. And so they left. They left Kentucky. They went to Ohio, which is basically just across the river. But they didn't stay in Ohio because they were just across the river. So they came on to Detroit. And they did fine here. They were, living and doing their thing. No problem. And we want to just loop back and say that NOLA had the largest slave market in the United States. And also there were 3 fugitive slave laws in the history of the United States. Most of us know about the one in 1850, which stated that everybody is responsible for returning, black folks to slavery if, you got to help. And in the U.S. Constitution, Jamon sort of, I couldn't quite catch the reference, but he said that was the first fugitive slave law. And then in 1793, there was a fugitive slave law, and that was in response to Haiti. And it said that the authorities have to help slave catchers. Okay, so Thornton and Ruth left Kentucky. They're in Ohio. They're in Ohio for a minute. Then they're in Detroit. I'm not gonna go into this crazy registration fee that most black people just ignored, but they're living here. He is a brick mason, Thornton is, and Ruth is a seamstress. They ain't really got no problem. A brother-in-law of the man who owned Thornton sees Thornton in Detroit. He don't approach him directly. He goes back to Kentucky. They get some court documentation or justification, and then they come back here with two slave catchers come back here, or bounty hunters come back here to get those 2 people, and they pay the sheriff and they pay 2 law enforcement officers $50 each to be a part of it. So it's like a group of 4 that's responsible for getting these 2 people back to slavery. And in between them leaving and when they were discovered in Detroit by this brother-in-law, the Nat Turner Rebellion had happened. So a lot of people who had left in, kind of before the Nat Turner Rebellion were suspected, accused, thought to have been involved with the Nat Turner Rebellion, whether they were or they weren't. But anyway, the law comes, they get Rutha and Thornton, and they put them in jail, which is now the Skillman Library. There's a meeting in the black community. There are at least 13 folks there. Women were in leadership. 2 of the women were Caroline French and Tabitha Lightfoot. So they're like, we got to free, Thornton and Rutha. Some of us were formerly enslaved, and if they think they can just come into Detroit and take people back, they got another thing coming. We have to let them know that they ain't just gonna be coming up here snatching us up, and they ain't just gonna be coming up here snatching up, our people. Because if they send her back, she gonna be a sex slave. If they send him back, they gonna kill him because they saying he has something to do with Nat Turner. So we got to make it unpleasant for them to deal with Detroit, as Jamon said. But anyway, so on June 16th, Sunday, after church, Tabitha Lightfoot and Caroline French go to visit Rutha in the jail. They take her food and they pray with her. While they're in there, Caroline French changes clothes with Rutha. Rutha and Tabitha leave, and they put Rutha on a boat, and she ends up in Canada free. She's she's moves on out of the reach of these people. And then on June 17th, they come to, it's Monday. It's time for them to take them back down south. That's their plan. And Carolyn says, I'm not Rutha. I'm Carolyn. I'm a free woman. You can't take me nowhere. My husband is coming. My husband is here. He got my paperwork. I switched clothes with Miss Rutha. She already in Canada. Sorry. Meanwhile, so they let her go. Meanwhile, 400 black folks have gathered outside of the jail. They have sticks, knives, guns, and whatever. The bounty hunters at some point they realize we're not going to be able to. At first they like, well, you switch places with Rutha, you going to really switch places with Rutha, you about to go down south. But at some point when the people are gathering outside, they like, okay, let's just get this Thornton guy, let's go with this, and maybe the people will calm down, you know, since she say she free, she got her paperwork, we ain't gonna fight this fight. So they you know, put Thornton in their little trailer, their wagon or whatever, with the 4 people, the 2 bounty hunters and the 2 law officers, and they go outside, and you know, it's the only way out is through it, so they got to ride through the people. So it's 4 of them and it's 400 of us. And so you know, they start trying to ride through, and the people are like, nah, nah, nah. And then Thornton is like, let me talk to the people. So he gets up, you know, maybe they'll listen to me. He gets up, he gets on the trailer, and he's like, I don't know if this is true or not, but Jamon is like, he gets up and he says, y'all hear what I said? Nah. And so the people got closer. Then he says, and the people didn't hear him, and they got closer. Then somebody hands him a gun. He take the gun, and he's like, you know, and the people are like, yeah, you got the gun. A lot of people are like, kill them 4 white people who are trying to take you back. He doesn't do that. He shoots up in the air 2 times. The folks in the crowd start throwing stuff at the white guys, bricks, sticks, whatever. The deputy, the sheriff, I think, gets hurt. And he ends up dying a couple days later. The deputy escapes, and the 2 slave catchers are just there by themselves. Meanwhile, some other people have hired, the cooks, a black family, have hired a wagon. The wagon arrives, that Thornton is taken out of the slave catcher wagon or whatever, and he's put into the cook's wagon. He's taken to the Detroit River, and he's taken across the river to Detroit. And not to Detroit, but to Canada. So that is kind of the beginning of the Underground Railroad in Detroit, an active, involved Underground Railroad. There's a white lash, of course, some of which leads to some legislation in Canada, because they do end up catching Thornton and Rutha in the United States. Is like, they're criminals. They incited a riot. You know, somebody died. I told you, the sheriff ends up dying. So you got to send them back. Canada, you know, takes the people, puts them in jail, then they kind of review the case, you know, and Canada says, we're not sending them back to get punished worse than they would get punished in our country. And that's a precedent, apparently, that still stands today. Even when they have extradition treaties with other countries, if your punishment is going to be worse in the country that you're going to be extradited to, they're not going to extradite you. And it started with these people, apparently. Mr. Blackburn, and where the Blackburns moved to Toronto, they start the first cab company, or he starts the first cab company, not the first black cab company, but the first cab company, and they end up owning 5 houses. They use those 5 houses to help people get resettled. So when people have run from this country and, you know, they move to Canada and they don't have anything, they give them a place to stay, food to eat, and clothes to wear until they can get established. So that was the first black rebellion in the city of Detroit. As a result of that, we had the first curfew in the state of Michigan. Negroes and mulattoes had to be inside by 9 o'clock the next day. There were no black and mulatto-owned boats were allowed to dock in Detroit, because they realized, oh shoot, they done took the people across in their boats. Okay, y'all can't dock here. And then 16 folks were hired or selected to help the deputy, and that becomes the police force. So that was kind of the Blackburn riot. I don't know. I guess I think the thing that I really appreciate most, or that's real heavy on my mind, and my they painted the same color, so they were just putting a primer down. I thought they were painting white somebody's house down the road. Is the fact that the Blackburns used their wealth, reinvested their wealth in helping other people. So anyway, that's what I got. I always enjoy hearing Jamon Jordan speak. I think I mentioned to you before that he does tours, and I had heard this story before during a walking tour, but a lot of the information, you know, it's an oral history tradition. So the first time I hear something, I haven't committed it to memory. Most of us, when we're learning history orally, you know, or through stories, we have to hear things several times before they become a part of our understanding, a part of our truth, and a part of what we can share with other people. So I do remember when we had the tour and we were in front of the Skillman Branch Library, Jamon said, you know, there's no marker here, but I'm here to tell you what happened, and I hope that you'll tell other people what happened. So that's what I'm doing. I'm just sharing with you. If you're ever in Detroit, the Skillman Branch of the library is kind of downtown Detroit, old Detroit. You know, check it out. And this is a little bit of the story of what happened there, a story that's historically significant to us black folks. So, did I say good morning? Oh, but if I say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, before I'm going to say it again. And I want you to be you, be fabulous you. Thanks for clicking, liking, subscribing, watching, thumbs upping, commenting, sharing, and for being you, being fabulous you. It is burning up here and it's starting to rain, so I'm gonna have to try to make a run for it in the house. Have a great day. Bye.